So I am talking about peace today. I'm talking about world peace. And I'm asking the question, is it a pipe dream or is it a possibility? And by world peace, I mean the absence of war as a means of resolving conflict. I don't mean the absence of conflict, but I mean the absence of war. Is it possible? And I have another favorite question I call the mystery question. Why do we still have war anyway? I mean, if survey after survey says that people want peace, how come we still have war? So before we look into that more deeply, I want to tell a brief story of an experience my husband and I had last year, just before the pandemic hit. We were in Panama City, and I had remembered watching the Panama invasion on television back in 1989. We were reading about that, and we were learning that it had been concentrated in an area called El Chorrillo, because that was where the headquarters of the Panamanian army were. And we wanted to go there. But our hotel concierge refused to help us, saying that he did not recommend we go. He could not guarantee our safety. So we talked to a friend we'd made on the street, and reluctantly, he said he would take us, provided we slumped down in the car. And he said it wasn't just our safety, it was his safety too, because we looked American and he would be with us. And so we're still taking this with a grain of salt. We slumped down in the car, and within 2 minutes of going into El Chorrillo, we see this very fresh, very large, very angry mural. And you can see the helicopters up here, and you can see the soldiers down here. And for those of you who don't speak Spanish, this means never forget, never forgive. And we're thinking, what are we missing here? This was 30 years ago, and this anger is so fresh. And what we were missing was the fact that 4,000 civilians had died in the Panama invasion, most of them from El Chorrillo. And what we were missing was the incredible trauma that had been inflicted on this community. Just a few days before Christmas, in the middle of the night, they're asleep in their beds, and then this. And people were found dead in their homes. There were people found actually fused to their cars because some new kind of laser weapon was being tried out. There were people found with bullet holes in the back of their head. Everybody was evacuated from their homes, and systematically, block by block, the homes were blown up and burned to the ground. And all we could think was, how come we didn't know this? Why didn't we know this? Now, the other story I want to share is just very briefly my experience in Rotary, my personal experience. And when I joined, you could not possibly have been more enthusiastic. I was already involved with World Beyond War. I was already starting a local peace group here in Collingwood, Ontario. And I was thrilled with the partnership between Rotary and the Institute of Economics and Peace. I was ready to go. And over my first year, I was having trouble finding how I could contribute, where I could contribute. And I started to have questions. I mean, if war is the greatest threat to peace, what was Rotary doing to help end war? And I knew that there were 2 trillion taxpayer dollars, that's our money, taxpayer dollars, that were going into war and the preparations for war. What was Rotary doing to help reverse that or get some of that money diverted to positive peace building? And finally, how is Rotary using its voice at the UN and on the world stage for the kind of big system, global shifts that we needed to shift to a peace culture? And I wanted to do these things. I wanted to work on ending war and making people aware of these military dollars. I wanted to look at it from a big systems point of view because I knew that there is a huge military industrial war machine out there that was basically undoing all our good deeds. And I couldn't just ignore it. And I didn't see then how Rotary could help me with this. This was about a year ago, and I actually resigned. But I was literally only gone for a month when I was invited to come back as district peace chair, given a mandate from heaven to talk about all aspects of peace, the positive peace initiatives, and what it would take to end war. And I was very excited again, but that only lasted a couple of weeks when I was given a stop order and told that actually all I could talk about within our district was Rotary's positive peace initiatives, the peace centers and the peace scholars. Now, I love the peace centers and I love the peace scholars, but that wasn't enough of a mandate for me. But I decided to hunker down and learn what I could about what was going on internationally with Rotary, because up until this point, I'd had a kind of Canadian point of view. And I talked to district peace chairs, different chairs. I probably went to a dozen peace conferences, podcasts, speakers events. I took every online course being offered by Rotary Action Group for Peace and by the Institute of Economics and Peace. And I took 2 or 3 in-depth courses being offered by World Beyond War. I was busy. And on top of this, I was put on a mailing list without any sort of context around it. And I was receiving 30 plus emails per week from Rotarians working within Rotary to prevent nuclear war. Now, nuclear war wasn't on my radar screen at all. And these emails were going right over my head. So I created a folder in my inbox and had them go directly there. And I read them over the weekend. But something happened over this period. I felt a shift inside me. And I became convinced, absolutely convinced, that Rotary could be instrumental in shifting our planet to peace. And I'd like to share just a couple of the experiences that were so pivotal. One was a conference I went to put on by a Rotary club in India and a Rotary club in Pakistan. And there they were, 2 nuclear-powered countries with leaders who were perfectly comfortable using religion to divide and a disputed border between them. And they were talking about how to decrease the tensions. I didn't know anybody there, but I felt absolutely privileged to be at that conference. And the second thing was a podcast that was put on by a Western group about the, quote, Russia problem. And I take everything that we hear in the Western media about Russia with a grain of salt. And I'm listening to the talking heads talking, and a voice comes from the audience, a Rotarian, who I believe is on this call right now. And she said, has anyone ever thought about talking to the Russian people? And I thought, yeah, what a concept. Instead of these talking heads, we could talk to the Russian people. And I went and looked it up. And as we know from last week's meeting here, there are 77 Rotary clubs in Russia. Some are flying below the radar screen and some are very quiet, but there are 77 clubs in Russia. Isn't that fantastic? And there are inter-country committees between Russia and the US and Russia and Canada. Isn't that fantastic? And then there was a Rotary Peace Incubator conference. I know several of you may have attended that. There were 50 proposals, and one of them just blew me away. It was a partnership between World Beyond War, one of my hats, and Rotary Action Group for Peace, the other one of my hats. Alison Sutherland and the Director for Education at World Beyond War, Phil Gittins, who happens to be a Rotary scholar. And they were going to put together 10 young people from 10 different countries for an online peace building course given by World Beyond War. And then they were going to mentor these people to implement a peace project in each of their own countries. And the countries were Cameroon and Uganda and Colombia. And I was just, what an opportunity for Canadian kids to get a window into the world, be rubbing shoulders with their peers in these countries. And we had the Canadian team put together and funded, and in there we were the #1 team for this pilot project, which is starting in September. Which now brings me to the emails. So I'm reading these emails. I'm diligent about reading them. They are going over my head, but gradually a lot is sinking in. And I'd like to share some of the insights I had. There were issues that I truly had not considered. And one was what I call the culture of denial. And of course, I hadn't considered the culture of denial. I was part of the culture of denial. And so much so that, let me just tell you a brief story. One weekend, literally, I had this epiphany. I'm reading the emails and my husband is disposing 3 bins of my books. And I'm feeling a little anxious and I run out and at the last minute rescue 1 book. And this is it. And this was a book that meant a lot to me in the 80s because it was about how consciousness shifts. I'm really interested in how consciousness shifts. How do cultures evolve? Like, how does consciousness shift? And briefly, it was the story about a group of Japanese scientists who were observing the monkey in the wild, the Japanese monkey, and at one point started dropping sweet potatoes on the beach. And the monkeys loved the sweet potatoes, but they did not like the grit from the sand. And then one day, one 18-month-old female monkey took her sweet potato to a nearby stream and rinsed it out, ate the potato, and loved it. And she showed her mother what she had done, and her mother loved it. And some of her friends picked it up and showed their mothers. And gradually, there was a sort of small group in the tribe who were actually doing this. And then one day, one more monkey who had never done this before took his sweet potato to the stream, rinsed it out, ate it, and he loved it. And to the amazement of the scientists, overnight, literally within 24 hours, nearly every member of the tribe had adopted the habit, as if the added energy of that hundreds monkey was a tipping point for the entire tribe. And this is what I mean by tipping point. Now, there's more to this story, but that's not why I'm telling you the story now. I'm telling you the story now because, to my utter amazement, this was not a book about the hundreds monkey. This was a book about preventing nuclear war. And I had no memory of that. I remembered the book vividly. I remembered what it had meant to me. I had no memory that it was about preventing nuclear war. So I say that I was basically a poster child for the culture of denial. Other considerations I hadn't thought about: the fact that there are thousands of military personnel training continually so that they can launch a bomb in minutes to destroy our planet. Think about the mindset that's going into that. I mean, even as we speak right now, there are submarines roaming the ocean with nuclear weapons on them. Think about the mindset. And this whole first strike doctrine that we've been reading about here in North America, where the United States reserves the right to drop a bomb on you if they think there's a chance that you might be planning to drop a nuclear bomb on them. And we all know how flawed the United States intelligence can be. And it's not just the US. I mean, NATO has a first strike doctrine as well. Think of the fear that that's engendering. Think of the readiness and the alertness and the anxiety that engenders in the world. We have to sort of always be on our guard. And this was a new one to me. The threat of use, I mean, they haven't been used, right? Nuclear hasn't been used since the Second World War, right? I mean, maybe nuclear deterrence is working. Except if I take a gun and I hold you up, I don't shoot you, but I hold you up and I rob you. Have I used the gun? Yes, I have. And that threat of use is out there all the time. And there was one presenter who actually told us about 30 times, known times, that the US has actually used the threat. But the threat is always there. So don't think nuclear weapons aren't, quote, being used. Plus the potential for error. There was another presentation where the presenter laid out a timeline from the Second World War to today and showed us 50 times, guys, 50 times that we were this close to nuclear disaster. And of course, we don't know about that. I mean, the nuclear industry doesn't want us to know about that. The industrial military complex doesn't want to know about that. Know about that. And he said, it's not a question of if, it's a question of when. When there's that many weapons out there, that many people handling them, that much going on, that much technology behind it, it's a question of when. And this one really, if you think about it, how more fundamentally undemocratic could we possibly be to have allowed our world to get to the place where just a few people in a few countries can make a decision that can impact billions of us? How did that happen? Fundamentally undemocratic. And finally, I don't need to belabor this, the staggering waste of money. I mean, now we're modernizing our nuclear arsenal, or we're expanding it, weapons that we can never use. So here we are today. We have about 13,500 nuclear warheads out there in 9 countries. Not one of these countries has a plan for recovery because there's no recovery possible. And it is those of us, you and me, who are outside the industrial military complex, we're the ones who can see clearly that as long as there are nuclear weapons, peace is not possible. So I can answer my question from the very first slide: pipe dream or possibility? As long as there are nuclear weapons, it's a pipe dream. So back to my question, how did we get to this place? I mean, honestly, if we all prefer peace, how did we get to the place that we are now with $2 trillion going into war and the nuclear situation where it is? And Einstein said, no problem can be solved from the same level of consciousness that created it. And I say that the level of consciousness that brought us here is based on old beliefs and fear and myth. So what are these kinds of beliefs? What do we keep hearing as a reason why we have war? Well, we hear war is inevitable. It's part of the human condition, right? It's part of being human. We've always had it. We always will have it. Don't we hear that? And we hear war is necessary. There are times when you have to draw a line in the sand for freedom and democracy. And yes, there are times when war can be justified as a last resort, of course. I mean, after you've tried everything conceivable, you have to have it there as a last resort. And finally, the industrial military complex is just too powerful politically and economically. You don't stand a chance. Now, aren't these the kind of reasons that we hear? But we're Rotarians, so we ask, is it the truth? Is war really inevitable? And the fact of the matter is that conflict may be inevitable, but war is a choice. It's a choice. China went 500 years without a war. The countries of Western Europe who used to be fighting all the time have gone the last 75 years without a war. War is a choice. And as for war being necessary, there may be beliefs about that at the time of the Second World War, but this is 75 years later, and a lot of research has been done that shows that nonviolent defense is far more effective, twice as likely to be effective without the death and destruction that comes with war. And as for war being justified, remember, to be justified, it has to be a last resort. But nonviolent alternatives, the human mind is infinitely creative. Nonviolent alternatives are proving unlimited. So war can never be a last resort. And if someone tells you it is, ask them to show you the other 999 resorts that they looked at first. And as for this one, when enough people are educated on the suffering of victims and the environmental destruction of war, many people have not made the connection to the fact that a number one contributor to our climate crisis today is war and the preparations for war. So when enough people are educated on this, the political support will disappear and the power of the industrial military complex will diminish. Okay, so if those aren't the reasons why we still have war, why do we still have war? And John Horgan and many others has done exhaustive analysis applying the scientific method to search for every conceivable possible correlation. And they found only one. Wars are made by cultures that celebrate or tolerate war. And we are living in a culture that tolerates war. And he makes the point that you can tell a pollster you oppose something, but real opposition means speaking up. Real opposition takes work. So we can think of it like this: the 250 wars since World War II, the money that is going into this, the situation now with nuclear, that's just the tip of the iceberg. Our culture is so much broader and deeper. It's in our heads and our games and our books and our historical markers and our education systems and our monuments and our music. It's everywhere. Last year for Remembrance Day, the Globe and Mail, which is the business paper in Canada, had 7 pages dedicated to Remembrance Day and did not use the word peace. Don't you think the word peace should show up? So how do we shift, given that it is so permeates our culture in so many ways? How do we shift our consciousness to a peace consciousness? And I told you there was something more to the story of the hundreds monkey, and this is it. The habit, it was just shocking. The habit of washing sweet potatoes jumped over the sea, and monkeys on the mainland also started washing their food in the stream. So it was as if there was this point when just one more person tunes into a new awareness, consciousness shifts so that that awareness can be picked up by almost everyone. And when we think about it, we know intuitively that that is true. We can look at the Berlin Wall. It was up for years. It came down on a weekend. Or we can look at the women's movement. I was part of a consciousness raising group in the 70s. It was exhilarating. And we all know that today, the world is completely different for our daughters than it was for our mothers. Completely different, consciousness shift. So we know intuitively this is true. So, Rotarians, I believe that we can bring that kind of awareness to shifting our world to peace. Peace is in our DNA. It's a fundamental core value of Rotary. It's one of our areas of focus. So let's go back to Einstein. How can we do this? How can we most effectively help shift our world to peace? Well, we have to start with ourselves. And if I could use myself for an example again, how did I not know? I had watched the coverage on TV. How did I not know the impact of the Panama invasion? And my husband and I subsequently watched a documentary called The Panama Deception, which I recommend. And they analyzed all the television coverage over the entire period. And they concluded that television sold the Panama invasion. The anchors talked about it was a good day today for our troops, and we did really well today, as if they were members of the force. And there was no mention, not once, of the dead civilians, and no questioning of the reason for the invasion. Noriega was a drug trafficker, or really? And we all know that wasn't the reason for the invasion at all. And finally, my personal favorite, one night on the NBC News, the US military occupiers were described as engaged in peacekeeping chores. And you saw the pictures. while the Latin American diplomats who had condemned the invasion were described as a lynch mob. Now, I don't think that the television anchors were selling us on this consciously. I think that they were receiving information they believed to be true and they were passing it on to us. And I think I, sitting there listening to it, was receiving information that I believed to be true and I did not question it. And this is when we have to develop a discerning mind around this so that we do ask the questions and we try to get to the bottom about what we're hearing in our news and so on. I also don't mean to pick on the US. It's just this example happened to be related to the US. So we have to look at ourselves first and wake up ourselves. And I know most of you in this audience, if not every single one of you, is doing that right now. Then we can look at the big picture and come back to the three questions. What is Rotary doing to help end war? How can Rotary make people aware of this money that's going to the military and get it shifted to positive peace building? How can Rotary use its voice at the UN and the fact that it's everywhere? Rotarians are everywhere. So I think if we want to answer this question, we consulted the scientists to understand how best to handle the pandemic. Let's consult the scientists on this. I watched the entire unveiling of the doomsday clock, and we know that they left it at 100 seconds to midnight. And we know that their number one concern was the accelerating nuclear weapons program. That was their number one concern. So if we're going to listen to the scientists and we're going to take this seriously, we need to start, every single one of us, becoming familiar with the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. It entered into force in January. And for the first time, we've had comprehensive treaties that outlawed chemical and biological weapons and so on. For the first time, we now have a treaty that makes nuclear weapons illegal for the countries who signed the treaty. And the treaty is oriented towards ultimately the total elimination of nuclear weapons. It also helps stigmatize nuclear weapons in the same way that chemical and biological weapons have been stigmatized. And even countries who haven't signed the comprehensive treaties don't use chemical weapons anymore because of the stigma. So it helps stigmatize nuclear weapons and serves as a catalyst for their eventual elimination. 86 states have signed the treaty. This is where we're at right now. 86 states have signed it, 54 states have ratified it, and 69 nations did not vote, including all the nuclear weapon states and all NATO members. So that's where we're at. So how can Rotary make the biggest impact on raising peace consciousness? Well, I would suggest that Rotary could start advocating for worldwide support of the Treaty for the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. I have permission to be just a little bit political here, but I can just imagine what many of you are thinking right now. She's suggesting we advocate for worldwide support of the treaty. God, what is wrong with her? What is she thinking? Doesn't she understand? She's been in Rotary for 3 years. You think she would have figured this out by now. Doesn't she understand? Rotary can't get involved politically. What is wrong with her? And my answer to that is this: I don't think so. Because I read Rotary magazine in February of this year about Rotary's success in eradicating polio in Africa. I read the article 3 times. And these were the 4 challenges that Rotary faced in making this happen. And how did they deal with conflict? Rotary and its partners negotiated truces and military protection. I'd like to know how you can negotiate truces without being political. And what about the issue of rumors? Rumors were making vaccinations a political thing rather than a means to save lives. So what did Rotary do? They advocated with government leaders and educated the public to dispel this misinformation. Advocated with government leaders. That sounds political to me. And what about the hard to reach children? Well, borders are very porous. So what did Rotary do? They coordinated campaigns with surrounding nations. Coordinated campaigns with surrounding nations. That sounds political. And then my personal favorite, political will. You know, there were countries in Africa where the political leaders really didn't care about eradicating polio. It wasn't a priority. So what did Rotary members do? They use their respected roles in society and often their own personal charisma to advocate to their governments to become active in polio eradication. Individual Rotarians went to the governments in their country and advocated for them to be active in polio eradication. That is the very definition of political. So I think we better properly describe our thinking. Or when we say that Rotary can't get involved politically, I think what we mean is Rotary can't be partisan. Of course, we can't be advocating for this government over that one or this party over that one. But it is an indisputable fact that when it comes to saving lives, Rotarians can be brilliantly and effectively political. Indisputable fact. And we could just as easily cross out eradicating polio in Africa and put in advocating support for the Treaty for the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, and we would face exactly the same challenges. And we could overcome them with exactly the same strategies. We've already done it. We did it brilliantly. We did it effectively. We've already done it. We know how to do this. We do. So what would be a first step? An easy one. We could apply the four-way test. Would worldwide support of the Treaty for the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons and the elimination of nuclear weapons on our planet make us safer? And the answer, of course, is yes, 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 and yes. A second step, many of you may not be aware that last year there was a resolution that went to the Council on Resolutions from our district, District 7010, requesting the Rotary International Board to consider supporting approval on the Treaty of the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. And that request went below my radar screen, and I talked to our club president, and he had no memory of it, but it did. And the Council on Resolutions voted, and what do you think the result was? 2-1 against. Now, I don't think our fellow Rotarians were rejecting the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons consciously, any more than I think that the television anchors were consciously trying to sell us, or me, on the PANAMA invasion. I think that our fellow Rotarians were looking at this and thinking in a kind of automatic way, oh, that looks political, no. And so I think that with education, that vote could change. And so what are we doing this year? This year we have another resolution that's going forward from our district, again requesting the Rotary International Board to consider endorsing this time the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. But something a little different has happened this time. This presentation was first made about 6 weeks ago to the Rotary Club of Collingwood, and within 2 weeks, their executive had unanimously approved the resolution and had put it out to a vote in the club, and only 2 members of a club of 75 had voted against it. But that's not all. People from our club reached out to contacts they had elsewhere in Rotary and told them about what we were doing and got them involved, and many, many more presentations were given, and at least 10 different districts now have a club in that district who is looking to approve the resolution and send it to their district to be endorsed. But that's not all. There was a presentation a few weeks ago to Australia, and present in the audience were clubs from 5 different districts in Australia. And in the discussion afterwards, every single one of those clubs asked for a copy of the resolution so they could take it back to their home club and discuss it, hopefully approve it, and send it to their district for endorsement. But that's not all. Another presentation was given, sponsored by one of the 24 Rotary representatives to the UN, and there were people there from all over the world. And at the end of that presentation, he was asked to send to 6 of these different clubs in 6 of these different areas. He was asked to send the resolution so they could discuss it with their club and raise it with their district, hopefully for endorsement. Now, I'm not suggesting that all of these districts are going to end up endorsing the resolution. I don't know where the process stands. I don't know whether they got club approval. I don't know. The deadline is June 30th, and we'll know better after June 30th. But what I do know is that there are clubs that are now talking about this in all of these districts. And what I do know is that at the end of every presentation, yes, there were a couple of people who strongly objected, but the vast majority of people were very on board with this. And I don't know that it's going to be as difficult as we think. I do not know SHEKHAR MEHTA, but I've heard him speak 6 times. I've heard him say these kinds of things. And he put together a video recently asking us to grow Rotary to 1.3 million under his tenure. He wants another 100,000 Rotarians. And the strategy he is suggesting is everybody bring a friend. So we may have more openness there than we think, but we have incredible support from the general public. Remember I said, those of us outside the industrial military political complex, we are the ones who can see clearly that nuclear weapons must be eliminated for us to be safe. And surprise, surprise, since the treaty has been ratified, recent polls, 70 to 80% of citizens surveyed everywhere support the treaty for the prohibition of nuclear weapons. Not everywhere, but nearly everywhere. And I would suggest to you that by endorsing the treaty, Rotary would be speaking for the 70 to 80% of citizens around the world who want this to happen. We would be amplifying their voice. We would be showing up for them. We would be recognizing how important this is to them. And I would suggest that if we do that, we become more of a compelling organization. We generate a lot more interest in Rotary. And that would be a perhaps better strategy for growing membership than everybody bring a friend. Which brings me back to my question. World peace, pipe dream, or possibility? What do you think?